Rocky was a compilation of really great actors, almost born to play those parts. I couldn't fill that spot. I loved him. I couldn't have done it without him. He's magnificent.
Sylvester Stallone shocked audiences with a raw, emotional confession on live television, promising to expose hidden truths about his deepest regrets.
He hit me so hard in the chest. The next thing I know, I was on a low-altitude flight, surrounded by 4 nuns. It was unbelievable. Can you believe that?
On the evidence of this dramatic moment, it seems he's breaking decades of silence. Viewers were left stunned. What is he finally revealing? Could Stallone be admitting a betrayal, a career regret, or a fractured friendship? Is this his first public admission of long-buried rivalry or hidden pain? Fans are hungry for scandal, secrets, and behind-the-scenes drama, and this promises to give them exactly that. Clash of Titans. Long before Sylvester Stallone sat under the harsh lights of a live TV interview and exposed the emotional truth about his Hollywood past, a silent war was brewing behind the scenes. It was the 1980s, the golden age of action cinema, and 2 muscle-bound titans emerged as frontrunners for global superstardom, Stallone and Schwarzenegger. To outsiders, it looked like healthy competition. But inside Hollywood's back corridors, their rivalry was anything but friendly. Their feud traces back to the late 1970s. According to both actors, it all started at the 1997 Golden Globe Awards. That night, Rocky had taken the world by storm, and Stallone, the breakout star and screenwriter, was poised for glory. But the camera kept cutting away to a young Austrian bodybuilder-turned-actor, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Stallone later admitted that he was furious with Arnold's smug reactions during the ceremony. Rumor has it, he even threw a bowl of flowers at him afterward. That first altercation marked the beginning of a rivalry that would span decades, shaped by envy, ego, and one-upmanship. As the 1980s rolled in, the two were cast in stark contrast. Stallone, the gritty underdog from Philly, with a chip on his shoulder, versus Schwarzenegger, the massive foreign-born machine with charisma and ambition. Their cinematic personas mirrored their real-life personas, and neither was willing to give the other an inch. Stallone had First Blood, Rambo, and Rocky. Schwarzenegger fired back with The Terminator, Commando, and Predator. It wasn't enough to succeed. They had to outdo each other at every turn. On every conceivable measurable scale, the greater box office draw, most weapons on screen, and slays per film, the rivalry reigns. The heat was even felt in interviews, with Stallone mocking Schwarzenegger's accent and Arnold putting down Stallone's scripts. It got crazily competitive. Stallone has confessed in later years that they would actually pick projects to outshine each other, never mind whether they were appropriate for either. Every casting decision became a battlefield. In a 1984 interview, Stallone said, "We couldn't stand to be in the same room." He was not exaggerating. Hollywood producers and executives were often forced to separate them at award functions and events. Insiders of the time confirmed that the two rival action stars even had contractual clauses stipulating top billing and equal screen time whenever the two appeared in the same movie. The sheer level of micromanaged ego was unprecedented. But while the competition was destructive, there were certain bonuses. Stallone later acknowledged that Arnold made him work harder, train longer, and think more strategically about his career. Years later, Schwarzenegger expressed the same view. "He made me better because I always wanted to beat him." Yet, there was still bitterness lurking beneath the surface, especially whenever a role slipped from one hand into the other's grip. This Cold War of cinema raged for years, but things would take a sharp, personal turn with one cunning prank that would humiliate Stallone and reshape the nature of their feud forever. The prank that backfired. At the height of their Cold War, Arnold Schwarzenegger pulled off a legendary move that would go down in Hollywood history as both cunning and brutal. While their feud simmered on the surface with sarcastic interviews and calculated movie releases, what happened next escalated it into something deeply personal, and for Stallone, humiliating. What looked like a simple film role turned into a career misstep and an emotional trigger that haunted him for decades. It began with a script, not just any script, but one so questionable that Schwarzenegger himself wouldn't touch it. The film was called Stop, or My Mom Will Shoot. Schwarzenegger has since revealed that when he saw the script, he knew it was terrible. Instead of passing it over quietly, he made a calculated decision. In recent interviews, including one quoted by Daily Mail and Entertainment Weekly, Arnold admitted to pretending he was interested in the film. He leaked fake enthusiasm to the press, fully expecting that Stallone, his bitter rival, would take the bait. And that's exactly what happened. It was said that Stallone, with the ambition to oppose Schwarzenegger on every project, jumped at the chance to sign. He considered the role stolen from competition, yet it was, in fact, a miserable low for his career. Stallone stated in interviews without hindrance, "That was the worst film I ever did." He described it to be junk and admitted to doing it only because he thought Arnold wanted the part. It got slaughtered by critics and wiped out financially, while Stallone was left holding the bag in shame. The prank worked, and the emotional scarring lasted far beyond the box office receipts. For Stallone, this was no professional embarrassment. It was personal. This gnawing bait struck at the very heart of his self-assurance. Some years later, a strange mix of hurt and disbelief colored Stallone's voice in the aftermath of this prank. He had not just fallen for rivals' bait, he had done so under public scrutiny, putting a very publicly mocked stain on the career. He went on to become an emblem of the success of their rivalry. Or perhaps the part that became bitter. For that mistake continued to haunt him down the years. Selling the most tickets was no longer the point. It had passed into quite another game, to a game of shame and humiliation. Such was the fact between the stars. Stallone had to accept that not only was Schwarzenegger a rival, but a manipulator who had outsmarted him at his own game. Also, the public saw it happen. Arnold's victory was public. Stallone's defeat was in private. That kind of betrayal, still covering itself with laughter, had a scar. Stallone has since said it was a lesson learned, though he never revealed anything else. It flares even now in his eyes when the film is mentioned. And yet, this moment, this so-called prank, did more than sting his ego. It triggered a deeper emotional spiral. Stallone began to reflect on the choices he had made, not just in film, but in life. And that internal unraveling would soon lead to unexpected confessions, deep regret, and a haunting awareness that success sometimes comes at a painful cost. Emotional fallout and regret. The prank may have lasted only minutes in execution, but for Sylvester Stallone, the emotional aftermath dragged on for years. Stop! Or My Mom Will Shoot didn't just flop. It left a lasting mark on Stallone's self-image, career trajectory, and emotional state. Beneath the armor of a tough guy persona, the sting of being publicly outwitted by Schwarzenegger triggered a quiet crisis. In later interviews, Stallone didn't just express anger. He hinted at something deeper, disappointment in himself. This wasn't just about a bad script or a box office failure. Stallone had built his identity around control. Control over his films, over his image, and over his legacy. Being tricked into a humiliating role by a man he had once considered his ultimate rival shattered that illusion. In one candid moment, Stallone admitted, "That was a moment I wish I could erase." There was no getting around it. He had been played, and it exposed a vulnerability that he had spent years hiding from the public. It was during this period that cracks in Stallone's emotional armor began to show. Privately, he began questioning his own instincts. How could someone who had written Rocky, a universally praised underdog story, fall for such an obvious trap? The answer wasn't just about ego, it was about validation. He had been competing with Schwarzenegger for so long that he'd become reactive rather than strategic. Instead of choosing films for their value, he was choosing them to win. And in that moment, he lost sight of what made his career unique in the first place. And while he responded to the emotional try, he had to deal with mockery and snide comments. The film turned out to be a favorite Hollywood joke, with Stallone bearing the brunt of it. What hurt was that this was not caused by critics or trolls. It was a blow delivered by someone he once viewed as a peer, perhaps even a friend. In subsequent interviews, especially where he went on television talk shows, Stallone's tone shifted when it came to talking about the incident. Brash bravado was replaced by just the tone of a tired man, tired of the rivalry, tired of postures, and perhaps most of all, tired of pretending that the feud didn't hurt him. At that moment, Stallone took a long pause to consider what he would want in the legacy he left behind. Would he be viewed as the guy who put forth every effort to beat Schwarzenegger with a stick? Or as the artist behind some of the most emotionally resonant movies in the history of action? It was quite a rude awakening. However, while the film Rocky inspired millions with the lesson of perseverance and dignity, Stallone himself had momentarily taken a detour away from these ideals to Yankee-style ego-driven rivalry. In the interval right after the incident, Stallone's determination to take charge of his own life became palpable. He moved further into the role of director and writer, while revisiting some of his classic characters instead of trying to prove himself with them against the competitors, to reconnect with the audiences and himself. If healing from the consequences of that prank constituted an unwanted dent on his career, it was also an awakening, a transformation that caused Stallone to perk up, get rid of all the layers of competition, and go face-to-face with who he had become. But what happens when bitter rivals start to soften? When decades of resentment begin to erode into something entirely unexpected? What came next wasn't more conflict. It was a surprising move toward peace, initiated in the unlikeliest of ways. Reconciliation through Planet Hollywood. After years of icy tension, bitter competition, and private regrets, the idea of Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger standing shoulder to shoulder seemed like an impossibility. But the most unexpected turn in their story wasn't another confrontation. It was a handshake, a contract, and the birth of a surprising alliance. The feud that once fueled their careers was about to take a commercial detour, thanks to a risky Hollywood business venture, Planet Hollywood. In the early 1990s, a strange idea surfaced among entertainment lawyers and Hollywood insiders. Why not capitalize on the fame of action's biggest stars and open a themed restaurant chain? Planet Hollywood wasn't just about burgers and memorabilia. It was a branding machine built around star power. Schwarzenegger was already on board, and Stallone still licking the wounds of his post-stop. Or My Mom Will Shoot's fallout received an unexpected proposal. One of Schwarzenegger's lawyers reportedly reached out and suggested that Stallone could join the business. To everyone's surprise, including his own, he said yes. The move was more than just financial. For two men who had spent over a decade trying to outperform and outmaneuver one another Going into business together was a signal that the tide was turning. Behind the press photos and corporate smiles, something real was happening. A thaw. In later interviews, both Stallone and Schwarzenegger would reflect on this period as the beginning of mutual respect. Stallone even admitted that sharing a business forced them to have actual conversations, real, human exchanges that had nothing to do with explosions or egos. "It was the first time I saw Arnold as more than a rival," he said. "We actually started to understand each other." Yet clever branding was foundational, really, to change this. Press events came with smiles for cameras, and there were even occasions where they appeared side by side at grand openings. Slowly, the public contention gave way to something warmer. The media noticed it. Audiences raised on their warm-blooded trade of cinematic blows now saw them work together as entrepreneurs, and the narrative was changing. Both actors seemed quite happy to let that happen. Reconciliation, however, did not mean forgetting the past. There were still moments of tangible, awkward silence, tension, and guarded interviews. But what this does is really just plant the seeds for something deeper. It seems that while both men got older, the action genre changes, but the two have discovered that their lives have been inextricably intertwined, not by rivalry, but through good action. Both have fought up to the top, both have experienced public failures, and both share the same weight of global fame. What later translated into odd partnerships on stage of sorts was that uncommon bond of understanding. In the Expendables films and in Escape Plan, the on-screen chemistry between Stallone and Schwarzenegger developed to an extent beyond imagination during the 1980s. This rivalry has come a far cry since its roots in open hostility and rivalry to one that has shared a brotherhood, not perfect, but honest. The rise of their bond from animosity to collaboration made a tale in and of itself that fans embraced and the media could not overlook. But for Stallone, it was not only a professional metamorphosis, it was an emotional one. All those years of grudges buried, of personal humiliation absorbed, and there was an understanding with his former enemy. Then came the final and most gut-wrenching revelation. Because when Stallone sat down for a rare unscripted TV interview, no one expected him to let go of his last guard and speak a truth he'd kept hidden from the cameras for years. Stallone breaks his silence. It was supposed to be a standard promotional appearance. Sylvester Stallone, seasoned Hollywood veteran, was doing the rounds to support a new project. But what happened during one particular live television interview stunned both the host and the audience. For the first time in decades, Stallone dropped the persona, the invincible action hero, and exposed a vulnerable truth that had been hiding behind years of rivalry, ego, and silence. In that moment, the mask cracked. And what came out was raw, emotional, and deeply revealing. During the interview, the topic of Arnold Schwarzenegger came up, casually, almost as a throwaway reference, but something shifted in Stallone's demeanor. He leaned back in his chair, took a breath, and let out a half-laugh that sounded more like exhaustion than humor. Then, almost unexpectedly, he admitted, "I loathed him. I really did, for a long time." The room went silent. The audience, used to light-hearted banter between action legends, had just been handed a dose of unscripted honesty. And Stallone wasn't done. "I fell for a prank. It cost me. And I carried that bitterness a long time." It was more than an acknowledgement. It was a confession. Stallone wasn't just talking about the infamous prank that led him to star in Stop or My Mom Will Shoot. He was talking about years of resentment, pride, and emotional weight. He admitted he had felt tricked, not just professionally, but personally. That admission, made live and without preparation, showed a man unburdening himself in front of millions. The action star who had once stood as the symbol of brute strength and grit was revealing the bruises that fame, rivalry, and pride had left behind. Hard to describe the actual fullness of the moment without recalling the aftershocks. Stallone, barely holding himself together emotionally, felt inclined to share feelings about how the rivalry with Schwarzenegger had forced certain decisions into his life that he has regretted, not just roles, but conduct, dispositions, and even self-perception. "I let competition blind me. It stopped being fun," Stallone said. "And I wish I had seen that sooner." Rarely do we see such vulnerability from a man who had based his entire identity on resistance. But here, live on television, Stallone wasn't just reminiscing, he was claiming his own past in a manner intensely private. This confession not only generated headlines, but also struck a chord with fans who had followed his career for decades. Social media went crazy with clips from the moment. Commenters praised him for his honesty, saying it was refreshing and long overdue. The tabloids ran with it, but for once, they weren't really sensationalizing it. Stallone's emotional exposure was genuine, and it resonated, for it was not about the scandal. It was about being human. About a man whose definition of life had been all about the strong measure, had come around to accepting where he had been weak, in a way that on-the-spot confession redeemed his entire story. Stallone was the once hot-headed newcomer who had fought his way through to earn great respect as an icon. He had always been battling, whether against the odds, against the industry, or quite often against himself. Now, in his advanced years, it seemed that he was ready to let go, to confess his sins, to heal. The feuding that had once been a survival instinct for him with Arnold slowly began to mature into a consciousness of two men who fought against each other until they realized they were actually hurting themselves. Perhaps that is part of what made Stallone's confession so strong. Not that he threw another under the bus, but rather that he put himself on blast. No bravado, but just honesty. For the first time in forever, the most potent things were not punches or bullets, but truth. What many overlooked in the emotional weight of that moment was the subtle insinuation by Stallone of a greater, unacknowledged burden faced by men in the spotlight, especially those cast as icons of toughness. Below the surface of confession lay a quiet condemnation of the image that he himself helped create, that of the unyielding alpha male. "We were expected to be unbreakable," he said. "No doubts, no fears, no cracks." Yet even as he spoke, it was already apparent that even legends such as Stallone face the heavy burden of feigning toughness. Thus, his revelation was not merely personal. It was collective. Stallone's emotional confession reveals more than a Hollywood rivalry. It exposes regret, reconciliation, and raw honesty. If you want more, like, comment, subscribe, and check out the video suggested on screen for deeper celebrity confessions and hidden stories.